The question that the big question I'd like to frame for our discussion going forward are first, I'd like to ask our European colleagues about what standards you're asked to meet. And then I'd like to move into some questions about what might help us on our permitting processes with local regulators. Would it be helpful to have a third-party certification that certifies treatments that meet that standard? Um, in the development of a standard, what sort of tests do we need to make of urine that would give assurance to regulators and to consumers, and which of those tests would be affordable and reasonable? So with that, I know Michel Reichmann and Michael Reichmann and Kai are here along with Nancy in person. And so let's open it up and have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Just having Nancy come on up to the front now. And Kai, if you're, oh, hi, Kai. Oh, and I see Michael Reichmann is here as well. Great. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. So am I supposed to stand up there? Okay, yeah, I think I might have my computer. I don't.
So perhaps we can start with that first question, give Michael and Kai a chance to talk. What standards in your programs have you been asked to meet in Europe?
Shall I start, Michel? It's good. Yes, so muted. Okay, so first of all, hello everyone. Good to be here on the third day. Let's go. I mean, Matthew, you showed it really nicely. There are quite a lot of different standards involved. I think the one of the most critical one when it comes to the business of urine separation, I mean, that's the fertilizer standard. If you're not allowed to, I mean, if you collect the urine for yourself, there will be no issue. But if you really want to make a product out of it and then actually finance your installation with selling the product, this will be the challenge. We achieved to actually get the license for one of the fertilizers, Aurin, here in Switzerland. And this has to do that the previous regulation actually really focused on the composition of the fertilizer. On the EU level, that's different, and on each EU country level, it's different. But there's a difference between an EU fertilizer and a national fertilizer. So in the EU, you have both. So it can be that the regulations in Germany are more strict than the EU fertilizer regulations, but also the other way around. The EU fertilizer regulations, they are being developed. I mean, it really changes a lot. I mean, in the interval of 2 to 3 years. So there are basically two conditions. One is the composition of the fertilizer. Is it a safe fertilizer? Does it have a nutrient content? Are the nutrients available? And so on and so forth. And the other one is really the origin of the fertilizer. So what is the raw material? And this is also, those are the two basic concepts for fertilizer regulations. So some countries, they really focus on the raw material, others focus really on the composition of the final product, and a lot of countries focus on both. And the EU does both. Now the EU has this Green Deal program. It's really focusing on circular economy. And within this context, they're also exploring the recycling of nutrients. I mean, a strong focus is really on recycling nutrients from wastewater treatment plants, like struvite, ammonium sulfate, and so on. And they are already in the regulations. But there is also, I mean, like human excreta is currently being investigated and evaluated as a possible raw material. But there has been no decision so far. When it comes to national legislation in the EU, you know, Switzerland is not in the EU. So EU, Austria, for example, has similar rules to Switzerland. So therefore, Aurin was also licensed in Austria as well. Since Auren is licensed in Austria, it can also be sold in other EU countries. So there's the mutual recognition. I don't know how this works with the states in the US. Maybe it's similar. I have no idea. But here there's a rule in the EU: if one product is actually can be sold in one, has a license for one country, it can also be sold in the others, although it might not be allowed to produce this product under these conditions in the country. So it has a lot to do about cheese and food and drinks and so on, but it's also applicable for fertilizers. So I think here you see the two routes for the EU. One might be really to get human excreta as a raw material on the EU level. Another one might be to enter the market via some countries which have different regulations. Yeah, so much about the fertilizer. I think this is really the most challenging one. The other one is safety of treatment facilities. I think there are quite a lot of different rules. I think the most important ones here are construction rules, and they differ widely depending on the country where you're in. So I think this is really, so when we look at the EU, we have experience with, let's say, Switzerland and France mostly, but they're really very strongly different. But I think this is, it might be challenging, but this can be done. But the fertilizers, I think that's the main challenge. So I talked a lot. Yeah.
I wanted, before Michel talks, I wanted to highlight that the US situation with fertilizers is very similar in that most of the regulations are around the content. We are also, this question of origin comes in. And so that's where we were talking on this American Association of Plant Food Control Officials about trying to figure out the origin issue. And I think that there's a lot we could do on cooperation to have similar claims about origin. So. Michel?
Yeah, I want to go on. Actually, Susanne just posted something in the chat. So there's I want to go on the fertilizer standardization, because there's some standardization work done in Germany already by the Dean. They have come up with a Dean spec, which is a preliminary norm for products from dry toilet systems, and that can be solid and liquid products. And Kai was also involved there, and this is one option how we can work around there to rather define measures how a product should come out of the system as an oppositional approach to the ISO 3500, where there's rather a system description and a description of testing processes for various sanitation systems. So I think it's very important to make sure that we know what we want at the beginning. Do we rather want a technical, like a urine technique norm? Do we want a urine product norm? And then also, who are the recipients of the norms that we want to establish, or in that case, does it make sense to establish this? Is it companies? Is it authorities? Is it end users? So I think there's a lot of questions we have to pose before we actually think about having this norm. I think there's a couple of goals that lie in the standard. It's creating credibility. It is creating trust among authorities. This is all very important to push our systems forward. But on the other side, it's also, we saw that on the ISO 3500, it is very difficult to come up with norms in theory where there's not a critical mass in established systems available already. Because many people have a stake in this, and many people want to say something about it, but if it's not really applied, tested on a larger range, then it's very difficult to have like realistic goals as well. And that needs to be really well weighed as well, I think. And then I'm rather focusing on the technical side now. If we think of systems to be included in a norm, like how can we have a broad range to not exclude systems, not focus on just very technical systems, but also systems like passive solar heating compared to a WUNA system? Like, how can we find measures that include all and not at the end hinder systems in the growth of the market? And yeah, and in the end, what I think is very important, we have such a big variety now to know where we are going, what are our treatment goals. And there we have a variety of different goals that vary from context to context. We have a goal of just stabilization, we have volume reduction, we have nutrient recovery. Sometimes we have only nutrient removal, we have sanitization, we have removal or handling of organic micropollutants and energy recovery. So this is all different approaches that vary from system to system. How can we include this into a standard to not make it exclusively this is a working system, this is not a working system, but this is a system working in this context, and this is another system. So yeah, maybe like a traffic light system or whatever can help there. And then I think at the end, something that's quite important is a very general thing that could be very useful in a standard, to have a common vocabulary defined, because I think there's in different countries many people talking about the same thing, but often in different languages, and that's not only by mother tongues, but also by vocabulary people defined for themselves that work. But to have a common language in terms of technical terms, I think is very important as well. And yeah, I think now I talked a lot. We can go more precisely to the questions as well again, and give Nancy a word as well.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciated that, Michel, in terms of framing. And I think if we were to open up to the broader group, one of the challenges I think we're going to face on this. Alyssa's got a question. Let's go to that.
Hi everyone. I'm gonna put my camera on for a second. So we didn't have very much time on Monday to present the Santa Cruz case, but we're running into this exact problem now about the vocabulary, and we're open to separating urine as from feces, especially in a public recreational setting, which we definitely have a need for here. We're also talking to other partners about doing this in homeless encampments and for tiny homes. So my question here, and I know we're an outlier because we do think you can, reclaim nutrients from the whole value chain, which is of it, what is excreta. But I'm just wondering, do you think, because there were two presentations this morning, is the main concern public health? Because at least with biosolids, the EPA has a composting is recognized as a treatment. Thermophilic composting is just straight up, it's a recognized science. So from what I'm hearing from you is, on the urine side, is this just so experimental because of the different treatment methods, in addition to the usage, where compost is also regulated? Does that make sense?
I would, yeah.
You were talking about, I loved, you mapped out what we just worked on for 4 years, and the California regulators are very open to this conversation. So we should probably combine the West Coast and the East Coast together and have like some type of discussion about what's being said out here.
Yeah, with urine, I think we're trying to avoid having the biosolid classification for a number of reasons. The big thing being the scale of treatment that has to occur and the scale of testing and licensure. And I think that that scale question gets into some of Michel's questions about like what are we trying to define here? Because in the United States, like a composting toilet is not under biosolids. It's going to be under some sort of state rule. And if and that composting system is highly prescriptive. So like when Biosolid says thermophilic composting is approved, they really mean very specific thermophilic composting setups with, and that's, it gets very complicated. And with the urine, there are the public health concerns, there are the plant nutrient concerns, there are the bioavailability concerns, all of that. But the urine licensing it for fertilizers also hits this scale question. For the University of Michigan, for its system, Nancy, what was our fertilizer license? For producing fertilizer, it's like $175 a year or something, right? Plus some other costs for the fertilizer, which is not a lot for like a large building. If we were thinking about putting this in the stadium and producing fertilizer, like another $175 a year permit's not a big deal. But if that was like a homeowner having to do that, that's starting to get prohibitive. And so the questions of like what scale is approved for these different treatment systems and outputs and uses is going to be very important.
Yeah, my point on the biosolids. On the regulatory environment here in California, we couldn't get insurance but we had to argue we weren't moving septage. So that we're saying human or compost or whatever dry matrix we're using. We argued against classifying it as a biosolid. Because we say a biosolid is a result of a wastewater treatment processes. And that's where Ryan Smith was very useful because he's in the wastewater industry. So there's like these ontological conversations happening right now of what is this stuff, right? However, we were able to like sneak in, well, compost is a regulated product by the EPA. So we regulated the toilet material as a compost. Does that make sense? And not a biosolid. But then we ran into the, plumbing regulation in the application in a house setting. And then we ran into the issue of moving it, right? And septage hauling. So like, I think your scheme maps out all the different terrains of the regulatory environment. And maybe the need for a global, we've visited some people in outside of Berlin who are doing great work on human, or they were in the film Holy Shit, Can Poop Save the World? And my question to the group is, now do you see how difficult it is when we're having the same battle for urine and feces when they're both excreta? So we're doing double the work here in California. Because if we're talking about excreta and doing in one facility urine diversion, we have to come up with two different schemes to manage those schemes, and they're completely different. So it's doubled the work. Does that make any sense? Has anyone encountered this in their projects? Because where's the poop going from these toilets? So anyway, that's kind of my big question here today, I guess. Because everyone's making presentations on urine, but where's the resource recovery on the other end of the human body? I don't.
If I could share my screen really quickly, I want to go back to this slide and talk about what precedents are helpful to set first. And so getting stuck on the transport and being classified as septage before you get to trying to apply for your your treatment system license is kind of tough. And so that's one of the reasons why we've been working on licensing at Michigan on a smaller system where the treatment is inside the building, because then we don't have transport to license. and that prevents a precedent from being set that we don't want. And so figuring out strategically which licenses, which specific part of the licensure is going to set the most preferential precedent, and pursuing that first is important, and then kind of moving backwards to that whole system. If you just go, I mean, it makes sense to kind of say, okay, we're going to permit the toilet, we're going to permit the plumbing, and then we're going to permit hauling it, and then the facility. But that each of those steps can set a precedent that you don't want. And so I think that strategic order is important. And I'm interested from the European perspective if you've hit similar issues on that in terms of the strategic order of permitting.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit that what Kai mentioned at the beginning of his talking, that, for instance, in Germany we have the case like everything, like we would like to handle the toilet waste as a solid waste, not as a wastewater or not as a biosolid, because there's no water in it actually. But we can't, because in Germany, and that might be similar in other European countries, you have for waste you have special keys accounted to everything that counts as waste. And I know, for instance, in Sweden it's different. Like they are free, as far as I understood, right? Maybe Jenna can correct me if I'm wrong, but they're like more is free. But in many countries it's restricted to, like, if you have a key number to it, then this can be classified. And as there is no key number, you cannot neither urine nor feces classify as a solid waste. And then you have this new movement in the European Union coming overlapping kind of, who takes the opposite approach and searches basically for sources of new fertilizer options, so to say. And that's where we are active within some network activities to try to get urine and feces, and that's again together combined into these resource approaches. And I think that's the most efficient way to go, because then everything that comes below is much easier, because you don't have to go through all the single fertilizer applications anymore, because it's allowed from the top basically. Of course it's not that easy, but the approach kind of shows the directions where we're going.
Yeah, and I think we've got a question here at Brattleboro. I just wanted to make a comment that, one of the things, everything I know about regulations I've learned from Mathew, so I'm not going to say a lot about this. I'm going to let him speak to those things. But there's this notion from a regulatory standpoint of early adopters, and the state of Michigan is very unique in that the on-site systems and so forth are regulated at the county level. There isn't a state regulation where a lot of states do have that. And so in some ways it made it an opportunity for us to find the counties that, were going to innovate with us and develop some models that we can then expand. And so as Mathew said, let's start with the simple system and then move from there to the other aspects. With the focus being kind of on trying to figure out, I don't know if we're going to go here, Mathew, now, but we originally started with, can we create a source separation category? It's not a waste category, because now we're getting into rare earth elements. We're getting into all kinds of other things and not just nitrogen and phosphorus potentially. And those things are coming along. So we're paving the way there. And then the last thing I'll say is, one thing that's been really helpful is to identify wastewater treatment plants in the US when they use Ostera or some other kind of struvite creation system that it's not categorized as a biosolid. So there's already precedent. And we have one of those in Michigan. We know that from Virginia, there are a couple other states where that's the case. And so again, we're the early adopter regulatory spaces where we can show this innovation and then try to move it into other states. And we have a question here, I think, from someone.
Thanks, Nancy, and hi everyone. Rachel from Wasted Again.
Yeah,
sorry, right, forgot. Rachel from Wasted Again. I just wanted to ask a series of questions that's connected to a lot of this, and I think Michel, you started speaking to this, but I'm curious how the EU or the various countries within the EU are regulating biosolids and urine as separate from biosolids. We were just in Europe talking to a lot of manufacturing and processing partners there, and we know that there's a lot of movement in France to bring in urine into farms because of the war in Ukraine and the prices of fertilizer. And there's like been this strain of organic options for fertilizing farms. So like curious, yeah, that's like a two-pronged question. It's about like how their different states and countries are defining biosolids versus urine, and also maybe the pathway towards organic. So that's one piece. The other piece I wanted to mention is, so we've been in talks with regulators in Massachusetts about getting our fertilizer. So we got our fertilizer registered in Mass, in the process of doing that in Vermont. And what we're also in conversations around the processing side of things. And what we're seeing that they're most likely concerned about is about all the emerging contaminants. And so one of the questions I have for this community, I was talking about with Kara yesterday at length, it's about like, how do we also prepare and prime these regulators with like what we already know about these emerging contaminants and have some sort of synthesis so that we can sort of like get ahead of those concerns. And I'm also curious how that conversation's been going down in the EU, if you've got anything to share about that.
Maybe if I can answer. I mean, there's no difference between urine and feces, or I mean, biosolids, that's something else. But I mean, when we talk about human excreta, basically the rules which would apply to urine will also apply to composted feces, for example, or burnt feces or ash of feces. The big issue is just that urine, because it's a liquid, it's somehow also easier to treat when it comes to pathogens. And I think compost, this is a critical point. It's the hygiene. I mean, is it really safe? And I think this is why people are more critical, I think, about compost. We talked about Cryptosporidium. And Cryptosporidium, if you really want to kill Cryptosporidium spores, I mean, you have to heat it up to 120 degrees Celsius. Now, compost will not have a lot of value anymore if you heat it up to 120 degrees Celsius. With urine, you can just, I mean, the spores, you could also just remove it by filtration or something else. So that's the issue of the solids as well, I think, and this is just a different challenge than for the urine, basically. Maybe the other point is biosolids. I mean, biosolids, it's a huge category, and we have a lot of different organic material, other materials, I mean, also manure, which actually gets on the market. And I think this is maybe, Nancy, that's something for us researchers and academia, really compare those different sources, you know, because we can say, hey, with urine, we can remove pharmaceuticals. I mean, you know, with activated carbon, we can really remove pathogens. We can maybe even easily remove PFAS, or PFAS is just not in there mostly. I mean, compared to wastewater, heavy metals are not in there, and then really show this is urine, this is compost. And even, I mean, also human compost is really safe compared to a lot of other materials which are being used out there. But what we just encountered is we went to, I mean, here in Switzerland, to the ministry, said, hey, look at this. We are so much better than manure with our product. They said, we don't care. It's a new product. We have new regulations. Manure is already in there. You have to adhere to the new regulations. But I think if we can start the discussion more from an academic point of view, I think this might be helpful.
Yeah, to your point, Kai, you're right. I mean, there's a lot of us who've done research and it's out there, you know, that maybe needs to be brought into a common frame. Yeah. We actually have a paper that's probably being submitted today that is a risk analysis of a urine-derived fertilizer and looking at exposure as a pharmaceutical kind of, and just showing that it is not more risky than existing irrigation waters used on most of the vegetables we're already eating. And so, you know, we have to put that kind of stuff out there. The other thing I think I'll just share is that when we talk to some of the utilities that have these Ostera systems that are not categorized as biosolids, and they don't want to be, their advice was monitor as if you are a biosolid. You don't have to submit it, but you have to have it available so that if the regulator comes, throw the data at them and say, yeah, and we've done this and this and this and this, and they'll usually walk away and say, okay. So that's the hope, I suppose. If somebody changes hard or somebody else comes into office and decides everything's a biosolid or whatever, that's kind of one strategy that we're going to be using. I think others are doing that because they are categorized as a biosolids, but we have to do, all the things that are required for a biosolid in the US, even though we're not required to do that with our permit for the fertilizer license.
I like this because, I mean, it shows a basic concept. I think we need to help the regulators because, I mean, they
Yes.
just don't know what our stuff is quite often. They know biosolids. So if we can show, hey, this is like according to biosolids regulations, although it is really not in the simple sense of biosolid. Yeah. I mean, this might be, maybe it's a pragmatic approach, but I think it might be the way forward at the moment.
I also think
Yeah.
there are really two categories of regulators we encounter: those who are familiar with the nutrient cycle, who are enthusiastic for the most part, and those who are not necessarily familiar with the nutrient cycle. So, when we talk to the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, they're just like super excited. Sounds great. We love it. Love that you have this fairly clean product that doesn't have a lot of contaminants. Excited to work with us. There are regulators, though, who are not necessarily familiar with the nutrient cycle, with different agricultural reuse products, the current issues of heavy metals with those agricultural reuse products, and need a lot of education. And I think what the comparison that Nancy just made of saying, like, well, we have this comparison between urine and reclaimed water, and always grounding in existing practices, in the fact that nutrients are recycled, in the issues with the current system, is very important with regulators who are unfamiliar, because it's very easy for people to get stuck in a fantasy of our current system, that everything is handled perfectly and everything's sanitized fantastically and everything's fine, and we're asking for this new weird scary thing. That's an easy framing for people to take on. And so if you can preempt that with always doing a comparison to the current system, it really helps those conversations move forward.
We have a question here coming in the room here in Brattleboro. Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim, and when Abe and I started this project in 2012, we went to our state and asked them how they wanted us to regulate us. And so we have worked with them for all this time, and we basically had to set up a permit for a wastewater treatment plant. So one of the things that occurs to me as I'm listening to everybody talk is that it really has a lot to do with the adoption curve and practice. And so as we are so early stage, all of us right now, and as this becomes a more familiar practice across the landscapes, it seems to me that that's when the regulations and policy will evolve towards what we show people. Like as we scale, they'll see what needs, so it's not a stagnant thing. It's always got to be evolving. And I like the idea of jumping off from where regulators are comfortable right off the bat, because then you get to do it. So whatever you have to do it, and then show them. And if you have to test all kinds of things that aren't even there, like heavy metals, which we did for years and years and years, it still established this relationship and comfort, so that we are definitely in a partnership rather than any kind of tense adversarial process at all. So I think the adoption curve is going to really be in our favor as we grow. So,
Thanks, Kim.
Maybe if I can just add something on this point that Kim just raised, having a wastewater treatment license. Well, I mean, this is the other point. I mean, we basically treat a compound of wastewater, and wastewater treatment, the regulation is environmental protection. Now, when we produce something, we go into agriculture, and this is something that wastewater treatment plants usually don't have to deal with. So we have to do both in some way. Sometimes it might be easier because you can have just a connection to a sewer system and then everything is taken care of. When you have a large house and you do with your urine in your house whatever you want, then you don't have to deal with that. But if you want to, at least in Europe, install a new system, you build a new house and you don't want to be connected to a sewer system because you recycle the urine, you have composting toilets, you recycle the gray water and treat it, then you get the second issue. And this is, I mean, this is where the ISO 3500 kicks in and all those other new norms. And I think this is a totally different aspect. And I think also for regulation and regulators, this is quite, I mean, you suddenly talk to someone completely different as well. So you have to find those different regulators. And Mathew, I think this is actually what you outlined very nicely with this new system. And then we really realized this is a paradigm shift. We have a totally new landscape of people and regulators we have to talk to. And I think this is also the reason why it takes quite some time to really move this out into the practice. No, I think when you just talk to wastewater treatment operators and they ask you, hey, all this urine stuff, why didn't it take off? And we have to tell them it is really a totally different system, and not only a wastewater treatment system, but in total.
Yeah, I think, Heidi, your point, one of the things that we've done at U of M, it actually started before ASAD, before the Convergence Accelerator, is bringing Mathew on. I think it was almost a year before Mathew, and putting the resources in to allowing him to travel and bring in other people to build relationships, building relationships with the fixture manufacturers, building relationships with people who know plumbing regulations, building relationships with the fertilizer industry, and going to their conference. We were told, come to the conference repeatedly. If they know who you are, then you start to get people moving in your direction. So there's a lot of time needed to do that. And so that's one of the things we've been doing through our asset project, is putting the resources in to start to build those relationships. And I know Mathew's invited some of the folks in the US along to participate in that. And it's paid off so far. So I think we're going to have to continue to do that. It's time consuming, but we're making progress. Was there a question over here that I saw? Or there's one here. Do you want to come up?
Maybe in the meantime, I add to this what you just said. I totally agree. And it's also about not making contacts available, but also seeing the new contacts. And as Kai mentioned, like wastewater is looking into like very long-term perspectives, but we need to also focus more on other people, learn their language, like thinking of architects, which are the innovators in the building scene. And if we go like have treatment systems in buildings, we need to connect strongly with the architects and adapt our language to be available for them as well. And now happy to hear a question.
Thanks so much for everyone, and I really appreciate all the work that you're doing on this side of things that I think is, oh yes, hi, I'm talking to all of you too. It happens to everyone. Yeah, I appreciate all the regulatory work that I think is really important for all of us. And sorry if I missed this, I heard it, I think, from the EU side around the regulations around struvite, but I don't think I've heard it on the US side. And I'm just curious, since I think I heard you say, Mathew, like urine's not going to be classified as a biosolid because it's not a solid. But what about like struvite and potential future solid-based products that are derived from urine? Are we thinking ahead on those types of regulations as well?
Sure. So thanks for that question, Christina. We've discovered through talking with wastewater treatment operators that the struvite is not being classified as a biosolid, although they, as Nancy said, gave the advice, the treatment operators said, collect the information as if it's a biosolid. And so we're still collecting some documentation on the conversations that have happened there. They appear to be sort of private conversations between wastewater utilities and EPA about how EPA is thinking about it. And so they have this preliminary judgment that it's currently not a biosolid. Yeah. And I also wanted to highlight something from our just previous conversation about travel and making connections. And I wanted to say I just was at the Plumbing Manufacturers International Conference last week, and I was excited to hear people from the International Code Council repeating talking points that Brian Horsley had made at the plumbing code hearings. And I think bringing someone from the Massachusetts Department, the Massachusetts Association, Alternative Septic System Technology Center, bringing Brian as a wastewater treatment operator to the plumbers and saying, here's someone who wants this in treatment, and having him speak directly to another professional is really important, because we often get this sort of like, well, that person's going to have a problem with it conversation. And so if you can stop someone from pointing a finger by putting another person like literally in the room who's going to say, I want this, that can make a huge difference. And that was, you know, as well as the support of so many people here, including Christina, who just gave a comment for that plumbing code proposal. Having those people in the room really makes a difference. So we had a couple questions that are coming in the chat. I wanted to say Trisha Nickerson had this question of what role do people expect conventional wastewater treatment utilities to have in a transition to source separation? And I thought that was an apt question to continue here with.
Maybe I could say a few comments, because it is an apt question. I know that Richard, when they started, was very deliberate in making sure they had a relationship with their local utility, and I think that's really important. And when we then started, at least in the US on our side of the projects, I think others may have done this as well, when we got the Infuse grant, and even since then, even with asset, we've made it a point to continue to go back in front of the wastewater utilities and introduce them to the concept, the language, and so forth. And then we're starting to see converts in very big and high places within consulting firms who are designers, within utilities. Through that process, we actually went up, Lucinda Lee, who's at Cornell now, maybe she's on somewhere, actually was invited ultimately. Well, we were invited, and Lucinda was the one to do the work, by New York City, who recognized that in certain parts of the city, their sewer shed it goes to a treatment plant that cannot take any more nitrogen, period. And they've got a plant, I think for Rikers Island, like 20 years from now, that might solve this, but that's 20 years from now. And right now, developers cannot densify in those sewer sheds because they cannot take more nitrogen. And so having that came out of this outreach into the wastewater world and coming up with examples. Paris, you know, another story like that. There are others. So I think I just want to put that out there. I think we need to continue that work, because even when I think Jamina and Kim and I did a workshop at a wastewater centered innovation conference in May. People came and were really engaged, and they were all learning. And so we're still teaching, I think, the industry what is possible. And I'll just close by saying my dream, and I don't think I'll see it, you know, in my lifetime, but maybe it'll be the next generation, is to really move the wastewater. I come from the wastewater world, right? You know, I've been in this for over 30 years. And my dream is for the wastewater industry to see itself as a producer, not a treater. You know, we're actually, it's a factory that's taking the carbon and turning the carbon into useful products. And they can do that more efficiently when they're not mixing it up with the nitrogen and phosphorus and trying to like low efficiency do everything together. But then they can be part of the nitrogen and phosphorus and maybe potassium processing and maybe other kinds of things that we find coming out of certain industrial wastewaters for sure, you know. And really transforming that mindset. And that's going to require the water industry to evolve and have innovative leaders in places where they can kind of move this. So I'm off my soapbox, but that's it. Oh, there's hands now in the room. That motivated some comments here. If you have hands, you have to come up here, because Kara, come up. Yeah. Yeah. That's okay. You can do that, and we can always come back.
I just want to like wholeheartedly agree with Nancy's missive, and I share the same vision. I think everyone here shares that same vision, and it is happening in the wastewater industry because they're calling themselves resource recovery facilities.
But we got to go the next step on that.
Yeah, totally agree. So I don't want to cut off any other thoughts that people have that might want to respond to to what Nancy just shared. I actually wanted to throw out a different question, which is, so far no one has brought up thoughts about whether there's any potential to get urine-derived products categorized as an organic fertilizer. And so I'm actually very, very curious if people think like, is that just never going to happen? Or is there a possible pathway, given like if we can avoid urine ever being considered biosolid? That sounds promising. So if anyone has any thoughts, I'd be very curious.
I'm sure Mathew has thoughts. He's thought about this, but.
Well, the FDA has said, in the US at least, the FDA has said that they consider urine a human waste. And so the national organic rules prohibit the use of human wastes in organic agriculture. I think that is a temporary regulatory barrier. It's one FDA comment on one rulemaking process. But that is, at least in the short term, going to be some sort of a blocking thing. And what the FDA said in their comment was that they, in terms of just fertilizer usage, they were interested in seeing they said there's an absence of treatment standards. So hence our treatment standards question here, right? So I think if we can answer that question in terms of what sort of treatment is happening, if we can define urine in a more clear way, we can initiate those organic changes to an organic process.
I'm gonna make a comment that Tatiana has something to offer, I know, on the organic fertilizer. Oh, is there somebody else? Kai, go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, maybe I can add something on that. We explored this option to have urine or urine-derived products as an organic fertilizer. Now, organic agriculture is pretty conservative. I mean, we tend to think that it's really progressive, but it's actually not so much. I mean, the rules are based more on historical reasons, not really scientific reasons at the moment. And at least here in Europe, what you do, you fertilize the soil and not the plants. So that means you have to provide a fertilizer or nitrogen compound, which is first degraded by the microorganisms in the soil, and then the nitrogen will be available to the plants. Now, when you look at urine, this is just not the case, because even urea is it's very quickly available and ammonium nitrate anyway when we have urine. And so this is critical. And the phosphate, I mean, the phosphate is readily available. I mean, we have, the phosphate in urine. So I think this is really a challenge. And so far, we were not successful to get one of those urine-derived fertilizers as organic fertilizer. And this really has to do with this theory and thinking what the organic fertilizer is. This is organic fertilizer. Now, organic agriculture might be something else, because organic agriculture under some conditions can also use other fertilizers. For example, in the spring, when you need a lot of nitrogen, even here in Switzerland, organic farmers, they use manure, which is from conventional farms, which is usually not allowed. And it's also a readily available nitrogen compound. And they really want to boost organic agriculture. So there should be more organic agriculture. And there's just not enough fertilizer around, organic fertilizer. So I really think this will move. And when you listen to Urs Nickli, which is really one of the pioneers in Europe on organic fertilizers, organic agriculture, he says, we will have to come up with new definitions what organic fertilizer is. So I think it will take some time. And again, as with the wastewater treatment sector, it will take, there will be a new generation that will actually help to move forward.
Well, I think we have 4 people in line here. We have created a line, so I'm going to let them start coming through.
Okay, I have some thoughts, but some of my colleagues here might have a different point of view. Richard's colleagues might have a different point of view about it. But we at Richard's queried so in the United States, as most of you probably know, the organic certification is done on a state-by-state basis. So it has to meet the federal standards, but it also can be different or more strict than the federal standards if states want it to be. So we first contacted our state regulator, Vermont Organic Farmers, and talked to them, and they were quite supportive.
Okay, sorry. Vermont Organic Farmers, which is the agency that certifies organic farms in Vermont. And now actually they also do New Hampshire because New Hampshire stopped having their own certification agency. But anyway, they were quite supportive, but they just didn't want to get out what they said. They didn't want to get out ahead of the federal standards. So we then talked to people who might help us move forward on going before the National Organic Program Standards Board and trying to see if we could get it certified. And they basically said, the person we consulted said, we would need to convince, basically the concern, and what Kai just said is that in the US, the standards are based on soil health. That's a big concern, like you said. But it seemed like the biggest concern was the pharmaceuticals. There's also some concern from the farmers we've talked to about impact on the soil microbiome. So basically, it seemed that I guess I want to say that I think it's possible that it can be certified by the National Organic Program if we're able to show them how much we can reduce the pharmaceuticals, and we're able to show them that the soil microbiome is not negatively affected over time. And luckily, we're doing some research on that right now. We finally were able to do some microbial research. So hopefully we'll be able to show that after 5 years. And I think it's just a matter of, are we willing to go through the process of going before the NOP and bringing our data? So.
Yeah, a couple other takeaways from that same process that we went through at Rich Earth Institute were that there's a very strict prohibition in the National Organic Standards on sewage sludge or biosolids, and then there's this more interpreted process of figuring out, is this actually good for the soil and good for organic farming. But I think that there's this critical distinction between biosolid sewage sludge on the one hand versus no urine is some other thing. And if urine gets classified as a biosolid or sewage sludge, then it is actually prohibited. Section what is it here? 205.105 that Arthur pulled up at his computer says number G is just sewage sludge. It's prohibited. There's no gray area around it, and that was put in after lengthy public comment when the standard was being originally adopted. People just didn't want sewage sludge, so it was sort of added as its own thing. So sewage sludge is definitely the red line. It cannot be that. It isn't allowed by law. And then beyond that, it's convincing the NOP that it is a good idea. In terms of does urine or urine-derived fertilizer feed the plant or feed the soil? And organic agriculture, like a couple of speakers have been saying, is that it's expected to feed the soil. I think it's relevant that there are a number of different urine-derived fertilizers. There is these highly soluble urine-derived fertilizer liquids that definitely are feeding the plant. But if it's a biochar-based fertilizer, or if it's urine that's used in compost, or if it's a struvite that is not very soluble and that will be released over a long period of time, it seems like those may be options that could be argued, not even argued, but just explained how those actually do go into the soil and are a slow release fertilizer over time and build soil health. So yeah, just wanted to share those thoughts. Oh, one other thought, sorry. One other thought is that organic farmers are the farmers who most want to use our fertilizer. So that's a constituency, is the farmers themselves, because it's hard to come by some of these available nutrients. And you can use a soluble nutrient in the spring when there's not a lot of nutrients being released from mineralization from the soil. So it actually does support a need of organic agriculture and organic farmers.
Hi, me again. I had two thoughts, one that was motivated by the current conversation, and then one that was motivated by what you said earlier, Nancy, about wastewater treatment plants being a source of products rather than just a treatment facility, which I think is amazing. But first, on the organic certification conversation, I'm curious about everyone's thoughts on kind of like what Sarah Nahar was saying in the keynote speech about excretory justice. And then nutrient sovereignty is an idea that our lab thinks about. And how organic certification has created a lot of barriers for a lot of people on this continent. And if we could challenge that moving forward while still perhaps striving for that certification for all the good reasons that I think we're together on, but reducing those barriers for people that can't afford organic food or can't farm organically certified because it's too expensive to get the certification, etc. I think you all know the barriers. And then second comment is, I'm curious, in these rooms, Mathew, like you said, you bring in people that might be in opposition potentially, and so you bring them together and you're having conversations about regulations. In those conversations, is anything coming up around the current situation where we do bring all these materials together in a wastewater treatment plant, including really toxic materials like things that contain PFAS? And when you present the idea that if we're removing urine from that story, then we're not contaminating our own nutrients with those industrial pollutants, are you seeing any aha moments, shifts, or motivations towards our cause in that particular context? Thanks.
Go ahead, Mathew.
Well, the first thing I'd say, Christina, in terms of another sort of way to sell things grown with human nutrients, I put a comment in the chat about how you can't actually have organic and vegan food right now because organic food is dependent on animal manures to grow it. And so you have this animal agriculture input to organic food. And so there is a lot of desire for people who are on vegan diets to remove animal products or animal agriculture from their diets. And that, I think, is a potential leverage point, something that could be used in terms of labeling food products, in terms of labeling agricultural products, that unless you're using recycled human nutrients, it's not vegan. On the other side, in terms of conversations that I've had about not contaminating, the wastewater treatment operators are very interested in alternative paths to nutrient recycling that are not biosolids, given the current problems they're having with biosolids and the threat to them of having to landfill by all their biosolids. Yeah, I haven't really heard that conversation from other groups. Other thoughts?
I have a comment, but I'm going to wait and see if others have something to add. I think Deb added something about. Oh, there's a hand. Oh, Alyssa. Thank you.
So about, I don't know if any of you saw the big New York Times article a few weeks ago about biosolids, and that generated a very interesting conversation here at the county level in Santa Cruz. And we did like a 1-hour podcast here on a local radio. There's a tremendous interest, but also about landfilling. I mean, we have to, I think as a collective, we have to start educating more regulators about this. I don't know if any of you are aware of Sarah's work and my work, because I'm in a PhD program as well at UCSC and talking about waste, and discard studies really communicates that there is no away. And we need to start looking at like a risk-based analysis for the future, because we're polluting water, not just soil. So this idea that, there's a completely safe, treatment chain anywhere really needs to be debunked. And then the other issue, not just executory justice, but, in California, there's real potential here to sway policymakers on the housing equity issue, because in California we have a lot of space and no place to build houses because of these onerous septic regulations, right? They cost about $125,000 a unit now. So I think there's some I don't know, there is a potential here for, I think, like a larger white paper, and most regulators cannot get through a lot of the science that you all are advancing. So my question is, how do we simplify this message so that everyone can kind of understand it? Does that make sense? Because if we're just focused on reclaiming the nutrients in urine, I think we're not going to move the needle in the regulatory environment to get more players into the field to demonstrate, yes, it's easy to do, it can be done. Because at the end of the day, we can't talk about nutrient recovery without talking about what comes first, which is sanitation, safe sanitation. Anyway, that's my comment.
I was just going to say, to that point, there's a session at 1:40 on strategies for sharing knowledge and knowledge sharing and communication. So we're going to continue that conversation on that comment. And then we have another comment here.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what Mathew just said, like that. I wanted to underscore what Mathew just said. If the wastewater treatment plant regulators or operators are worried about where they're going to send all of their waste, and we want to take some of that and put it to a good place, like that's a place where relationship building comes into place. It's like, hey, we have a similar interest here. How can we work together to make this happen? So that struck me as being really poignant.
Yeah, I'll just comment that in the several years I've been going to wastewater audiences and talking about this, and there is often a light bulb turning on, and like, this makes sense. Then there's all the embedded infrastructure we have. How are you going to do this? So the first question is always like, where are you going to do this first? Because their first head goes to a house. And, our implementations, there can be houses, obviously Cape Cod's an example, and others. We're looking also at multi-use, applications and installations like Kai has done in Europe and others. So I think they're all of the above, and it's very location specific. But just that I think that there is an ability in the communication, and I agree wholeheartedly with the need for us to have. We were talking last night over dinner, some of us, about talking points and how we get us as a group. And I think the EcoSan network is really positioned to start doing this kind of work as an industry. So I have like 16 thoughts, but I'm going to not say them. I'm going to let Mathew take control here again. So.
I hope other people have some thoughts. I wanted to highlight what Alyssa had mentioned about discard studies. And if you follow Max Lebyron's work on discard studies, it's very interesting. I bristle whenever I hear in conversations that it's not human contact. You'll hear it in plumbing, you'll hear it in manufacturing. They'll say, oh, this product is not human contact. And over the long term, everything is human contact. And I think moving away from this idea that we can use toxic materials or dangerous products that get released to the environment and claim that they're not human contact is a bad framing, and I agree that we need to move away from that. But that may be a bit of a distraction from what we're talking about right now.
I was going to make one kind of comment. I know we're coming up on time here, but I think, I don't know, Julia will tell me what we can and can't do. For asset, and a lot of the work we're doing, obviously, we all think about the food nutrient cycle. That's the, approach that's been here. For asset, we decided to take a step back because of the need to really help with this onboarding of concepts and ideas and focusing on non-food applications. So we come up with numbers like our 1 urinal based system at U of M produces enough nitrogen to fertilize 2 football fields worth of turf every year. Or we can fertilize the golf course that people who go to the football game park on to tailgate. Coming up with kind of translation of concepts. And that's just 1 urinal in a campus that has 65,000 people. And so imagine what we can do. We can easily, we did the calculation just the other day, 3,000 acres, we can do that, boom, no problem. We get just all the urinals converted and collecting them. So I bring that up because when we spoke to our grounds and landscaping folks, our goal at our campus, and I think you're going to see this with other institutions, is to have 0 imports by 2035 of fertilizers. And they're already about 70% of the way there fully with organic fertilizers, but they talk to us in depth about the limitations that organic fertilizers posed. And I think this was brought up by Kai, I think, in terms of the availability early in the season of needing a readily available fertilizer. We do outdoor graduation and the grass looks like shit in their IDs because they haven't been able to fertilize it because they can't use the blah, 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 blah. And their eyes are glowing like, oh, well, we can use your product. And then we can, have it look really nice for graduation because, and then we'll keep the weeds from taking over, which take over before we get. So there was this whole cascade of ideas just in one 45-minute conversation with our landscapers and help get to this goal of eliminating all imports. And this is all part of a larger effort on the campus to get to zero carbon and to be a more sustainable, livable campus. And we are not going to be the only campus in this country and in the world to try to do things like this. So those are opportunities, I think, to, again, get early adopters who provide visible opportunities for us to show what's possible, while continuing the conversations with all these different players. And what I'm hearing on this is we have a lot of information. We're not, I think in the afternoon, it'd be nice to talk about how do we, what is the output where we can get that information into a form that people will read. And it may be different products for different audiences. Kai, the thing I'm thinking about, and I don't know if this is a possibility, is an IWA report, because then you start getting to the wastewater industry with some of this stuff. And I don't know, just a thought.
Maybe, I just want to second what you said about having other applications in food. I mean, in the end, we also want to prevent that so much chemical fertilizer is used in some way. And I just realized we did some tests also on the soccer field, football field here in Switzerland, and I just realized how much nitrogen fertilizer is used. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's more than for food production on a hectare, And so, I mean, if we can replace this fertilizer, this already makes sense. I mean, whether it makes sense to use so much fertilizer anyway for soccer fields, that's a totally different topic. But I mean, at least it is being used at the moment. And organic, I mean, they're also under pressure. At least Zurich and some other cities in Switzerland are under pressure. They shouldn't use chemical fertilizers anymore, but they cannot really use organic fertilizers because they don't want to have this buildup of soil on a soccer field. They don't want to have that. It should be sand and a little bit of grass, but not soil. So what can you do? So I think there are definitely avenues we could go on. And I mean, in the end, it's really, we have to find our niches where we can move forward. And maybe it's a soccer field. Oh.
I forgot one thing that the leader of our landscaping, 3,000 acre space he's in charge of handling, and he made the comment, he said, your product sounds like it's higher quality than the organic product and he says, I'm okay with that. It doesn't have to be organic. But if we produce it ourselves and it's higher quality, I can totally not only sell that to the administration, but I want to do that. So that was one person, but obviously with enough of a conversation, N equals 1, we made progress there, so. Okay, Mathew, take control. Julia's about to bring the hook.
All right. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for sharing these insights. Mathew, if you have any concluding thoughts, I'm going to then pass it off to Sean, who's going to bring us into lunch and our break.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm interested in concluding thoughts from Kai and Michel as well. And please, Julia has dropped into the chat a few times. We have an EcoSan permitting group here in the United States that we run quarterly talks focused on different states and the permitting issues around both urine and feces related issues. So if you're in North America, please join that. And I look forward to continuing these conversations, and hopefully we can work together to figure out on an international level how we do some of the things that Michel outlined around standardizing our terminology and coming up with standardized definitions about what we're doing and who needs these technologies. So thank you for joining us, and Michel and Kyle give you a chance for some final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you to you, Mathew, to really have us here in this panel. I think this was a really lively discussion. I think it's really, I mean, we just see it. There's so much to do, but also so many possibilities. When we compare to wastewater treatment, where we just treat the wastewater, here we also have different markets and possibilities, and I think this is also exciting.
Yeah, thank you also from my side for the invitation. I think this was an excellent, almost a workshop, I would call it, because this is an opportunity. We get so many people from so many backgrounds having a stake in this topic and giving their opinions. And I think summing up and taking it from here and taking it a step further, I think that was a great kickoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Let's give all of our panelists a round of applause, some appreciation.